In the early 2000s, Silicon Valley was a place where, honestly, dreams were spun into gold. It was a land of ambitious founders who promised to change the world with just a single brilliant idea. Into this world stepped a young woman named Elizabeth Holmes. At just 19 years old, she dropped out of Stanford University with a vision that was as bold as it was captivating. She wanted to completely revolutionize healthcare, a field that had been resistant to radical change for decades. Holmes presented herself as the next Steve Jobs, even adopting his signature black turtleneck. She spoke with a deep, confident voice, telling a story that really everyone wanted to believe was true. Her company, Theranos, was going to make healthcare accessible, painless, and personal for everyone. The core of her vision was simple yet profound. Holmes claimed that traditional blood testing was outdated, painful, and inefficient. It required large vials of blood drawn from a vein, a process that, honestly, many people feared. The samples then had to be sent to large, centralized laboratories, and patients often had to wait for days or even weeks to get their results. Holmes promised to change all of that. She envisioned a world where a tiny drop of blood taken from a simple finger prick could be used to run hundreds of different tests. This would make health information available to people instantly, empowering them to take control of their own well-being. It was a powerful and inspiring story that resonated deeply with the public's desire for better, faster, and cheaper healthcare. This compelling narrative was the foundation upon which Theranos was built. Holmes was not just selling a product, she was selling a future where disease could be detected earlier and managed more effectively. She spoke of a world without long waits for lab results, where chronic conditions could be monitored daily from the comfort of one's home. Her pitch was perfectly timed, tapping into the tech industry's belief that every problem could be solved with enough ingenuity and determination. People were drawn to her charisma and the sheer force of her conviction. She seemed to be a once-in-a-generation innovator, someone who could see a better future and had the will to create it against all odds. The excitement surrounding Holmes and her idea was immediate and intense. She was hailed as a visionary, a prodigy who was on the verge of disrupting a multi-billion-dollar industry. The media celebrated her as a self-made female billionaire, a role model for aspiring entrepreneurs everywhere. Her story was a perfect fit for the Silicon Valley mythos, a brilliant college dropout with a world-changing idea who was challenging the old guard. This initial wave of enthusiasm created a powerful momentum that would carry Theranos forward, attracting attention and money long before anyone had a chance to ask the hard questions about whether her incredible vision was actually possible. The stage was set for a spectacular rise, built entirely on the power of a promise. At the heart of the Theranos promise was a small black box. This device, which Holmes named the Edison, was supposed to be the key to unlocking the future of medicine. According to the company's marketing, the Edison machine was a masterpiece of miniature engineering. It could take a single tiny drop of blood from a finger prick and perform a vast menu of complex diagnostic tests, from cholesterol levels to cancer markers. The results, Holmes claimed, would be available in a matter of minutes, not days. This was the technology that would make the old, clunky laboratory equipment obsolete. It was a promise of speed, convenience, and a new era of proactive health management for everyone. The story sold to investors and the public was one of unparalleled innovation. Holmes explained that her company had developed proprietary new technologies that allowed it to work with such small sample sizes, a feat that the established medical diagnostic industry had believed to be impossible. The Edison was portrayed as a self-contained, automated laboratory that could fit on a tabletop. The plan was to place these machines in pharmacies, grocery stores, and even people's homes. This would democratize health information, taking it out of the exclusive control of doctors and large labs and putting it directly into the hands of patients. The idea was incredibly appealing, suggesting a future where a quick trip to Walgreens could provide you with a complete picture of your health. However, what was happening inside the walls of Theranos was very different from the story being told to the outside world. The Edison machine was plagued with problems. It was unreliable, producing wildly inaccurate and inconsistent results. It could only perform a very small number of simple tests, falling far short of the hundreds that Holmes promised. The technology simply did not work. Insiders, including engineers and scientists who worked on the device, knew that the claims being made were impossible to achieve with the current state of the technology. They faced immense pressure to create a machine that could live up to the founders' grand promises, but the fundamental science was not there. To hide this reality, Theranos began to engage in a deep and systematic deception. When it came time to demonstrate the technology to potential investors or partners, the company would often stage fake demonstrations. In some cases, they would use commercially available third-party blood analyzers from companies like Siemens to run the tests, while pretending the results were coming from their own Edison machines. The blood samples, which were supposed to be tiny finger prick drops, were often secretly diluted to create a larger volume that could be run on these conventional machines. This elaborate charade was necessary to maintain the illusion that the revolutionary technology was real and functional, keeping the money flowing and the dream alive. With a powerful story and the illusion of a working technology, Elizabeth Holmes set out to build her company into a Silicon Valley giant. She was a master at fundraising, using her charisma and unwavering confidence to convince some of the world's wealthiest and most influential people to invest in her vision. She presented Theranos not just as a company, but as a movement that was going to change humanity for the better. This high-minded pitch, combined with the fear of missing out on the next big thing, proved to be an irresistible combination for investors. Over the years, Theranos raised an astonishing amount of money, totaling more than $700 million from private investors who were eager to be part of the revolution. The company's valuation soared at a breathtaking pace. As more and more money poured in, Theranos was seen as one of the most promising and valuable private companies in the world. At its peak, the company was given a valuation of $9 billion. This number was not based on actual revenue or profits, as the company had very little of either. Instead, it was based entirely on the belief in its future potential, the potential of its technology to disrupt the entire healthcare industry. This massive valuation made Holmes, who owned a large portion of the company's shares, a billionaire on paper. She became a media darling, appearing on the covers of major magazines like Fortune and Forbes, celebrated as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. The rapid growth of Theranos was fueled by a culture of extreme secrecy. Employees were forbidden from talking to each other about their work, and different departments were siloed to prevent anyone from getting a complete picture of what was happening. This was justified as a necessary measure to protect the company's valuable trade secrets from competitors. In reality, this secrecy served a more sinister purpose. It prevented employees from realizing the full extent of the fraud. Anyone who raised questions or expressed doubts about the technology was often intimidated, marginalized, or fired. This created an environment of fear that allowed the deception to continue unchecked for years. This combination of a massive valuation, celebrity status for its founder, and a secretive internal culture made Theranos appear to be an unstoppable force. The company was able to attract top talent, luring engineers and scientists who were excited by the prospect of working on such a groundbreaking project. It also began to form major partnerships, most notably with the pharmacy chain Walgreens. The plan was to install Theranos wellness centers in thousands of Walgreens stores across the country, which would bring the company's blood testing services directly to the public. This partnership gave Theranos a huge boost of legitimacy, making its promises seem all the more real and imminent. A key part of Elizabeth Holmes' strategy for building credibility was to surround herself with powerful and respected figures. She assembled a board of directors that looked more like a president's cabinet than the leadership of a typical tech startup. This board was filled with men who had deep experience in government, diplomacy, and the military, though notably, very few had any expertise in medicine or diagnostic science. Among them were two former United States Secretaries of State, Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. Their presence on the board lent an incredible amount of gravitas and legitimacy to Theranos. If men of this stature were willing to back the company, many people reasoned, then its technology must be real. The list of prominent board members did not end there. It also included former Secretary of Defense William Perry and former United States Senator Sam Nunn. These were individuals known for their wisdom, integrity, and careful judgment. Their endorsement of Holmes and her vision was a powerful signal to the rest of the world. It suggested that Theranos had been thoroughly vetted by some of the most serious and experienced leaders in the country. For investors, this all-star board served as a powerful form of insurance. It helped to soothe any doubts they might have had about the technical details, as they trusted that these distinguished men would not associate themselves with a fraudulent enterprise. The investors who poured money into Theranos were just as high profile. The list included titans of industry and finance, such as media mogul Rupert Murdoch, who invested over $100 million, and the Walton family, the founders of Walmart. The DeVos family, including former Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, also invested a significant amount. These were sophisticated investors who were accustomed to making big bets, but they were completely captivated by Holmes's story. They were sold on the idea that they were getting in on the ground floor of a company that would be bigger than Apple or Google. The allure of enormous profits, combined with the social proof provided by the prestigious board, was a potent cocktail. The presence of these powerful figures created a self-reinforcing cycle of belief. The impressive board helped attract prominent investors, and the list of prominent investors helped convince more influential people to join the board or invest. George Shultz, in particular, became a passionate advocate for Holmes. He allowed his grandson, Tyler Shultz, to work at the company. When Tyler later tried to warn his grandfather about the fraud he was witnessing inside Theranos, the elder Shultz sided with Holmes, unable to believe that the brilliant young woman he so admired could be deceiving him. This demonstrates the powerful spell Holmes cast, using the credibility of others to build a fortress of legitimacy around her lies. For years, Theranos operated behind a thick veil of secrecy, successfully managing to keep its technical failures hidden from the public eye. However, behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. Inside the company, a growing number of employees were becoming deeply concerned about the gap between the promises being made and the reality of the technology. Scientists and engineers who had joined the company with high hopes were confronted with a machine that simply did not work. They knew that the blood test results being sent to the few patients who used their services were unreliable and potentially dangerous. Many faced a moral crisis, torn between their loyalty to the company and their professional and ethical obligations. The first significant cracks in the facade began to appear not from the outside, but from within. A few brave employees decided they could no longer be complicit in the deception. One of the most important was Tyler Shultz, the grandson of board member George Shultz. After witnessing firsthand the scientific failures and the company's efforts to cheat on proficiency tests, he resigned and eventually became a confidential source for a journalist. Another key whistleblower was Erica Chung, a young lab associate who was shocked by the company's disregard for quality control and patient safety. They knew they were risking their careers and facing the wrath of a powerful, well-connected company, but their conscience compelled them to speak out. These internal concerns found their way to me. In 2015, I was an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I began receiving tips from former Theranos employees who told a story that was completely at odds with the company's public image. They described a culture of fear and intimidation led by Holmes and her partner Sunny Balwani. They detailed how the company was using its much-hyped Edison machines for only a tiny fraction of its tests, while secretly running most of its samples on standard, commercially available equipment from other companies. This was the critical piece of the puzzle that exposed the core of the fraud. The revolutionary technology at the heart of the company was a sham. Armed with these tips from brave sources like Tyler Shultz and Erica Chung, I began a months-long investigation. It was a difficult process. Theranos, with its powerful lawyers and influential board members, did everything it could to stop the story from being published. They threatened lawsuits and tried to intimidate my sources. George Shultz, still under Holmes's influence, tried to pressure my editors to kill the story. Despite the immense pressure, we persisted, carefully verifying the information and corroborating the accounts of multiple former employees. It became clear that this was not just a case of a startup exaggerating its progress. It was a massive, deliberate fraud that was putting real patients at risk. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published my first article detailing the problems at Theranos. The story sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley and the business world. It directly challenged the narrative that Holmes had so carefully constructed. The article revealed that the company was not using its proprietary technology for the vast majority of its tests, and that the Edison machines were highly inaccurate. It quoted former employees who described the deep deception at the heart of the company. For the first time, the public was presented with a version of the Theranos story that was not controlled by Elizabeth Holmes. The carefully polished image of the visionary founder began to crack. Holmes and Theranos immediately went on the offensive. Just hours after the article was published, Holmes appeared on the business news channel CNBC. With her characteristic confidence, she vehemently denied the allegations. She called the article false and stated that the company was a target because it was trying to change the world. "This is what happens when you work to change things," she declared. "First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." She tried to discredit the sources and portray the story as an attack by entrenched interests who were afraid of her disruptive technology. For a moment, her defiant performance seemed to rally her supporters. However, the initial article was just the beginning. As more information came to light, the story began to unravel at an accelerating pace. Federal regulators, including the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, launched their own investigations into the company's laboratory practices. Their findings were damning. In early 2016, a CMS report identified severe deficiencies at the company's main lab in California, stating that its practices posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. This was official confirmation from a government agency that the problems were real and serious. The company's key partner, Walgreens, suspended its relationship with Theranos and shut down the wellness centers in its stores. The cascade of bad news was relentless. More former employees came forward, feeling emboldened by the initial reports. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation into whether the company had deceived its investors. The media, which had once celebrated Holmes, now turned a critical eye on her and the company, digging deeper into the years of false promises. The fortress of credibility that Holmes had built with her powerful board and investors crumbled. It became clear to everyone that the $9 billion valuation was based on nothing but a lie. The dream of Theranos was turning into a nightmare. With its secrets exposed and its credibility destroyed, the collapse of Theranos was swift and total. The regulatory and legal pressures became overwhelming. The sanctions from CMS were severe, including a ban that prohibited Elizabeth Holmes from owning or operating a medical laboratory for 2 years. This was a devastating blow, as it struck at the very heart of the company's business. Without the ability to operate its labs, and with its primary retail partner gone, the company had no path forward. The once celebrated innovator was now facing the complete ruin of her empire. The dream that had captivated Silicon Valley had evaporated. In March 2018, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes Theranos and the company's former president, Ramesh Sunny Balwani, with massive fraud. The SEC alleged that they had raised more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate years-long scheme in which they exaggerated or made false statements about the company's technology, business, and financial performance. To settle the charges, Holmes agreed to pay a $500,000 fine, give up her remaining shares in the company, and be barred from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. This civil settlement marked the end of her career as a CEO, but her legal troubles were far from over. The more serious charges came a few months later. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted both Holmes and Balwani on criminal charges, including wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. These were not just fines or business restrictions. These were felony charges that carried the possibility of long prison sentences. The indictment alleged that they had not only defrauded their wealthy investors, but had also defrauded the doctors and patients who had trusted the company's blood tests. This elevated the case from a story of business failure to a story of a crime that had endangered public health. The two would now have to face a jury of their peers. With no money, no partners, and no hope of recovery, the company that was once valued at $9 billion officially ceased to exist. In September 2018, Theranos sent a final email to its shareholders, informing them that the company was formally dissolving. The remaining cash would be used to pay its creditors, leaving nothing for the investors who had poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Holmes's vision. The house of cards had completely collapsed. The story of Theranos was no longer about a spectacular rise. It was now about the legal and financial consequences of one of the most audacious corporate frauds in modern history. The criminal trials of Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani brought the final chapter of the Theranos saga into a public courtroom. The two were tried separately, allowing prosecutors to focus on their individual roles in the massive fraud. Holmes's trial began in late 2021 and became a media sensation. Her defense team attempted to portray her as a well-intentioned but naive entrepreneur who had been misled by Balwani, who was not only her business partner, but also her secret romantic partner. They argued that she had been emotionally and psychologically abused by him, and that he was the one truly in control. They claimed that while the company may have failed, it was a business failure, not a criminal fraud. Prosecutors, however, painted a very different picture. They presented a mountain of evidence, including internal company emails, text messages between Holmes and Balwani, and damning testimony from former employees, investors, and even patients. They showed the jury how Holmes had personally and repeatedly lied about the capabilities of Theranos' technology. They demonstrated that she was the ultimate decision-maker, the charismatic leader who was the face and voice of the company. In January 2022, after a long trial and days of deliberation, the jury delivered a split verdict. They found Holmes guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors, but not guilty on the charges related to defrauding patients. Sunny Balwani's trial followed a few months later. His defense tried to argue that he was simply an investor who had been duped by Holmes just like everyone else. However, prosecutors presented him as the enforcer, the man who managed the company's dysfunctional laboratory and bullied employees into silence. The evidence showed he was deeply involved in the company's financial projections and operations. In July 2022, his jury came back with a verdict that was even more decisive than the one in Holmes' case. They found Balwani guilty on all 12 counts of fraud, convicting him of defrauding both investors and patients. The verdicts against both leaders of Theranos sent a clear message that their actions were criminal. The sentencing hearings revealed the final consequences. In November 2022, a judge sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. A month later, Sunny Balwani received an even longer sentence of 12 years and 11 months. Both began serving their sentences in 2023. The lengthy prison terms underscored the seriousness of their crimes. The judge in Holmes' case noted the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the staggering amount of money lost. The era of promises was over, and the time for accountability had arrived. The legal system had finally caught up with the lies that had built and sustained Theranos for more than a decade. The downfall of Theranos left a trail of financial devastation in its wake. The more than $700 million that investors had poured into the company was completely wiped out. Wealthy families, hedge funds, and sophisticated venture capitalists lost everything they had put in. Rupert Murdoch lost over $100 million, and the Walton family lost even more. In addition to their prison sentences, Holmes and Balwani were ordered by the court to pay $452 million in restitution to the victims of their fraud. This massive sum was intended to compensate those who had lost money because of their lies, though it is highly unlikely that they will ever be able to pay back such an amount. The financial damage was immense and irreversible. But the harm went beyond just the financial losses. The fraud also hurt the patients who used Theranos' services, believing they were getting accurate and reliable information about their health. While the jury did not convict Holmes on the patient fraud charges, the evidence showed that people had received incorrect test results, which in some cases could have led to improper medical decisions. The story also damaged the public's trust in the healthcare and technology sectors. It created skepticism about genuine medical innovations and made it harder for honest entrepreneurs to gain the trust of investors and the public. The shadow of Theranos loomed large over Silicon Valley, a stark reminder of how ambition, when untethered from ethics, can lead to disaster. The story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos serves as a powerful cautionary tale with several important lessons. For investors, it is a reminder of the dangers of FOMO, the fear of missing out. The investors in Theranos were so eager to be part of the next big thing that they failed to do their basic homework known as due diligence. They didn't demand to see audited financial statements or have independent experts verify the technology. They were swayed by a charismatic founder and a board of famous names, and they paid a steep price for their lack of skepticism. The saga highlights the critical importance of asking hard questions and not just believing a good story. Ultimately, the rise and fall of Theranos is a story about the line between ambition and deception. It is normal for startups to have a bold vision and to project confidence, a practice sometimes called fake it till you make it. But Holmes and Balwani crossed a critical line. They did not just exaggerate their progress, they lied systematically about the very existence of their core technology. They faked demonstrations, falsified data, and endangered patients, all to maintain an illusion and keep the money flowing. The lesson is clear. While ambition can fuel innovation, it must be grounded in truth and integrity. A vision built on lies will, sooner or later, inevitably collapse.